In the light of the judge's more severe and formal eyes, you need to be especially careful in critiquing the research essay. In the previous lesson, I reviewed some additional points suggested by the writer's triangle for this assignment. As always, remember in using the writer's triangle, each point of view overlaps the others, since from each perspective you are looking at the whole essay. In this lesson, I will discuss the student's paper in relationship to the writer's triangle. These are the 3 points I suggested you use to evaluate your own voice as the writer in the research paper. When using outside sources, remember your credibility depends greatly on the credibility of your sources. You need to have enough information to be able to support your thesis. And finally, being able to express your thesis and research in your own words reveals you as being in control of your essay. To evaluate the writer's voice and credibility, a good place to begin critiquing the research paper is at the end of the paper, at the Works Cited page. Looking at the student's Works Cited page, I would judge his research adequate for a paper of 6 to 8 pages. The student photocopied 20 articles and identified others he could have used. He uses 7 sources. 4 of the sources are signed, giving the author's name, and one of them is a textbook. The sources represent publications with solid reputations. Current history is the most scholarly of the periodicals. The sources are all reasonably current. Even the specialized encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of the Third World, is the 1992 edition. The book was published in 1987, but that is recent enough to provide valuable background information. The average reader might not look up the sources used by the student, but I did. In fact, I examined all the sources consulted by the student. I noticed that several articles contained references to the book by David Layton and Said Samatar, Somalia, Nation in Search of a State. Clearly, that book is considered an authoritative source by those writing on the subject. The article in Current History provides biographical information about its author, Rakia Omar, noting that Omar is himself a Somali and is the executive director of Africa Watch, a human rights organization. Being a Somali, Omar will probably have strong feelings about the subject, which should remind the student to be careful about any judgments that Omar makes. Still, because of his background, we expect Omar to be well informed on the subject, and his article provides a concise history of the events that led up to the tragic fighting in Somalia. More information, if it could be found, representing the warring factions themselves, might provide more insight into the Somali conflict. But the sources seem to come from qualified observers, and the student has a solid base of information with which to prepare this assignment. More sources signed by authors would probably provide him yet greater authority. The third question I asked regarding the writer focused on his ability to explain his research in his own words. Returning to the beginning of the student's essay, and reading with this question in mind, several flaws in the student's use of his sources becomes apparent. The student has done what many students do when writing research papers. He has found good sources, but rather than synthesize the information to support a thesis, he has cut and pasted the sources together. In addition to suggesting the student has not really mastered his subject, this practice of pasting together sources often results in a form of plagiarism. This is a common flaw in student research papers and deserves careful attention. Remember, any sort of plagiarism is a serious matter. I will examine the student's essay carefully and illustrate the problem. First, I want you to compare the student's first paragraphs to the paragraphs by Jane Perlez, one of his sources. In the first 2 paragraphs, the student describes the Somali population in words and phrases borrowed from the source Perlez. Compare these paragraphs. Somalia was once thought of as being Africa's most homogeneous nation. Its 8 million people speak a common language, are all Sunni Muslims, and almost all lead nomadic pastoral lives. And then the passage by Perlez, Somalia has appeared to scholars as possessing the basic ingredients for a cohesive nation. The nearly 6 million Somalis speak the same language. Almost all of them are Muslims of the Sunni sect, and most lead a nomadic pastoral life. Note also the similarity of these two passages. Despite these common threads, one ruthless dictator, with the help of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, armed a nation. The original article by Perlez reads, "But underlying these common themes is a deep clan rivalry that in the last 20 years has been enhanced by the armory of modern weapons supplied by both Cold War superpowers." Comparing the two passages, it is obvious the student based his passage on that of Jane Perlez. Much of the wording is identical, though he accidentally changed her figure of 6 million to 8 million. Note also how the student's short paragraphs develop nearly identical material, and how similar the transitions are from the first to the second paragraphs. The student merely substitutes threads for themes as he writes his transition despite these common threads. Even though the student has tried to put some of the material into his own words, he still is closely following the organization of the Perlez article. Such use of a published source without documentation is considered plagiarism. Following the introduction based on the Perlez article, the student shifts to the book by Leighton and continues to describe the Somalis. However, instead of using the phrasing of Perlez now, he uses the phrasing by Leighton. Again, compare the student's passage to that of Leighton. The student writes, 6 branches make up the Somali lineage system. 4 of the branches are overwhelmingly nomadic, pastoral clan families, the Dir, the Dayrud, the Isaac, and the Hawiye, and 2 are predominantly agricultural, the Dijal and the Rahanwin. This is the Leighton passage. The major branches of the Somali lineage system are 4 overwhelmingly pastoral families, the Dir, Darwood, Isaac, and Hawiye, and 2 predominantly agricultural ones, the Dijal and the Rahanwin. If the student had intended to plagiarize, I suspect he would not have documented his source at all. The fact that he did document the correct text and page number in parentheses indicates to me that the student really doesn't understand the nature of using direct quotations. Quotation marks should be around all words and phrases that are quoted from Leighton. Given the rather generic nature of this information, I wonder why the student followed the original so closely. This is the sort of information that could easily have been put in the student's own words. The student's failure to summarize, paraphrase, or quote his sources along with his failure to document them is evident throughout the essay. Here is one more example. During the 1960s, the Somali Youth League, a pro-Western party, dominated the country's politics. 6 days later, the army took control in a bloodless coup d'etat. The Constitution of 1960 was abolished along with all political parties. The country's name was changed to Somali Democratic Republic. In the Encyclopedia of the Third World, the passage appears this way. During the 1960s, the Somali Youth League, a pro-Western party, dominated the country's politics. 6 days later, the army seized control in a coup. Power was assumed by the Commander-in-Chief, Major Siad Barre. The 1960 Constitution was suspended. All political parties were abolished, and the country's name was changed to the Somali Democratic Republic. Highlighting all the passages that are clearly borrowed from the encyclopedia's article, it is clear that many of the student's words and phrasings are copied from the text. Probably, as I said earlier, the student did not intend to plagiarize. It is important here to pause and define the term plagiarism. The most easily understood definition of plagiarism is the using of another's material without documentation. You must document anything you borrow, whether you quote it directly or represent it by using a paraphrase or a summary of the information. This applies not only to using another's words and phrases, but also to another's ideas and information. One additional point to remember: paraphrases and summaries must be in your own words, even if the source is cited or documented. As the research paper was drafted, the student would be guilty of much plagiarism. Merely changing a few words does not make the material you write your own. When you paraphrase or summarize another's work, you must put the ideas and information into your own words. Overall, the student fails to establish an authoritative voice in the essay. The student has gathered credible sources and done some good basic research. However, his inability to present general information in his own language suggests that he really has not mastered his material. Neither has the student organized the material to support a specific thesis. Instead, he discusses one article, and then he looks for an important information in the next article. The student fails to synthesize information in support of his own thesis. The weakness in the student's voice implies a failure to master the material collected for the research paper. When I critique the essay from the second point of the writer's triangle, the subject, the failure of the student to synthesize his information becomes more apparent. When critiquing the subject, I encouraged your asking these questions. Does the essay treat the subject objectively, using a variety of sources representing various points of view? Is the thesis of the essay supported adequately by the research? And have you synthesized your findings to support your thesis? The discussion of the sample essay from the perspective of the writer touched on these points. The student has done a good job collecting credible sources for his paper. However, the student has not done a good job expressing the material in his own words, and consequently, the concerns of his sources surface over the student's thesis. Though the sources could support a reasonably objective treatment of the subject, by not developing a clear thesis and by not synthesizing his information in support of the thesis, the treatment of the subject becomes an incomplete restatement of a loosely related series of articles. Reading the introduction to the student's essay, I think the third paragraph is intended to be the paper's thesis. Now 2 men in a struggle for power are using deep-seated clan rivalry that has only been successful in causing anarchy, brutal death, and destruction. The paragraph is only this one sentence. The preceding paragraphs refer to the homogeneous population of Somalia and mention a ruthless dictator and the 2 superpowers, but whether they are important to the thesis is not clear. Examining the conclusion of the paper raises more questions about the thesis. The student has 3 short paragraphs concluding the research paper. First, he briefly describes the suffering inflicted upon the Somalis. Next, he mentions the partial blame of the superpowers for the suffering. And finally, he states the conflict has eroded the social structure of the country. The first 3 paragraphs are more or less parallel to the final 3 paragraphs. The thesis should state more clearly the relationship the student sees in these 3 ideas. A more effective thesis might be stated in the following way. The breakdown of traditional Somali institutions, combined with the self-serving policies of the United States and the former Soviet Union, makes resolution of the civil war in Somalia especially difficult. Referring to the role of the clans, the effect of the superpowers, and the destruction of Somali society, this thesis, which I proposed in the second lesson of this unit, seems to synthesize the ideas presented in the first 3 paragraphs of the student paper and restated in the conclusion. Whatever thesis the student finally composes, it needs to integrate or to synthesize the student's research more clearly. Until the student can state the significance of his research, he will be unable to synthesize the material he has gathered for the research paper, and that leads the student to cut and paste articles together instead of synthesizing his information to support a thesis. The extent to which the student organized his material by articles instead of by the logic or requirements of the thesis is evidenced by a quick survey of the essay. Not only are examples of plagiarism quickly apparent in the first few pages, but also how the student develops his essay by jumping from one article to the next is evident. He uses the Perlez article to begin his essay. Following Perlez, the student shifts his attention to the book by Leighton for the next several pages. Nearly all of the second page of his essay discusses the importance of camels in Somali culture. The information is interesting, but it contributes nothing to understanding clan rivalry in this essay. The information on camels is never related to the conflict and to the destruction in Somalia. Pages 4 through 6 rely mostly on the Encyclopedia of the Third World. From the middle of page 6 to the end of page 7 of the student paper, the student refers to the Omar article. In fact, almost all of page 7 is a direct quote from Omar. Finally, the essay ends with references to Girardet, reviewing the draft of the student essay and the original sources. You can see how the student pieced together his paper. Failing to use his information to support his own thesis, the subject of the essay remains only vaguely defined. The essay contains a loose survey of interesting information about Somalia, but the information is never brought together to clearly analyze a problem. Evaluating the essay from the point of the subject on the writer's triangle, a major revision of the essay is needed. A major revision of the student's essay using the tentative thesis, an outline presented in Lesson 2, follows the original draft in your supplementary course materials. Studying the 2 drafts should help clarify for you the difference between a research paper that synthesizes its findings and a paper based on the cut and paste method. Shifting my critique from the perspective of the student to that of the audience, some additional flaws in this paper are evident. These questions need to be considered. Does the audience need any special background knowledge to understand the essay? Would presenting the qualifications of some of the sources add credibility to the text in the opinion of the reader? And do you properly document your sources so the reader can locate them? Clearly, most research papers will require some treatment of background information. The challenge for you will be to determine how much background information is needed. If your readers are experts on the subject, you might need to explain what particular aspect of a subject is important to you and why. You would probably not need to define many terms. If your readers lack any special knowledge of the subject, you will probably need to identify important names and to define special terms. The student may have had troubles writing the sample research paper because so much of the information was probably new to him. Certainly, even when the Somali crisis was at its worst, few Americans really knew much about Somalia. Explaining the importance of clans in Somali culture and describing how the power struggle developed between the various clans would be necessary for this paper. However, as presented, the information about camels is irrelevant to the sample paper. To determine what background information to include, the student should have examined the major parts of his thesis. Since the paper lacks a clear thesis, the student was apparently unsure what to include and what to leave out. This is one of the major issues in writing research papers. When you gather much information, There is always a temptation to include most of it in your paper. You should include only that information which is relevant to your thesis. Extra information will only serve to confuse the reader. One bit of information the student did not include was information about his sources. Often it is effective to include in the text of the essay a brief statement noting the expertise of a particular individual which you cite in the essay. Mentioning the title of the article by Omar on page 7 is less effective than noting Omar's qualifications. The student wrote in an article entitled Somalia at War with Itself, Rakia Omar clearly describes the importance of the manipulation of loyalties. Writing this would have been more effective. Rakia Omar, the director of human rights organization Africa Watch and himself a Somali, explains the importance of the manipulation of loyalties. The title of the article is not really that important. The expertise of the author is. The final question I mentioned in consideration of the audience addresses the right of the audience to check the sources used in a research paper. Documenting your sources is more than a way to assign credit. It also helps others interested in your topic to find information which may be of use to them. If you fail to document your sources accurately, you deprive your audience of part of the value of your research. The sample student paper is correctly documented for the most part. In a few instances, he cites an incorrect page number. He fails to list the second author of a book by Layton and Samatar. And finally, there are a few errors on the works cited page. Most of his errors seem careless in nature. They raise questions about his note-taking and editing. As I pointed out when discussing the first point of the writer's triangle, the expression of the writer's self, the research papers are expected to maintain a formal tone. Careless errors can frustrate an audience and cause them to question your competence as well. Finally, I will focus directly on the text of the essay. You need to consider, do you present the information in an objective manner? Do you maintain a formal level of diction? And do you incorporate your sources in the text properly? Generally, the student maintains an objective tone throughout the essay. The least formal passage is probably in the conclusion. The student presents a description of Mogadishu, quoting several details from the article by Girardet. In the spring of 1992, the once pleasant city of Mogadishu, with its pastel-colored Italian colonial facades, whitewashed houses, and ancient Arab souks, was reduced to a sprawl of ruined and looted buildings. The streets, with rubble, unexploded shells, wrecked cars, and corpses, were picked clean by crows, lizards, and stray dogs. This graphic description of Mogadishu captures the tragic plight of the city. The vision of corpses being picked clean by crows and lizards and stray dogs, though probably a factual statement, plays more on the reader's emotions than the more impersonal statistics reporting the current number of dead at 40,000 or that 4.5 million faced starvation. Girardet used this passage as a hook or introduction to his article. The more formal report followed. The use of this passage may be appropriate by the student given the actual horror faced by the city of Mogadishu, but it does lean more to an emotional tone than an objective one. The writer should be aware of that. The student also needs to be careful about making quotations fit the context of his paragraph. Substituting the verb were in brackets accidentally changes the Girardet article. In the student's version, it seems that the streets themselves were picked clean by crows and dogs, and not just the corpses. Remember, when incorporating quotations into your paper, the syntax of the quotation must fit that of your essay. However, if you alter a quotation, check that you do not alter its meaning. Reporting on the violence and the tragedy in Somalia effectively, the overall diction of the essay is formal. The student, for the most part, avoids getting caught up in sensational accounts. Written consistently in the third person, the student does not refer to himself, nor does he refer to the reader in the second person. The student does a good job of following the assigned method for presenting and documenting his sources. When you prepare your essay, make sure you know what style of documentation your instructor wants, and then follow the guide provided. The greatest problem students face in the draft of his essay is his use of too many long quotations. Looking at the last 2 pages of the essay, you will discover the student has only about 2 original sentences. The rest is all quoted material. Too many quotations actually undermine the authority of the writer by suggesting that the author has nothing really to say. All he can do is copy quotations. As a rule, only very effective passages should be quoted directly. General information should be paraphrased or summarized in the text itself. Examining the student research paper and the commentary on the paper should help you understand and avoid the common errors committed in the writing of research papers. Again, be sure to study your handbook when you finally edit your paper. The formal nature of the research paper requires that you follow the assigned style manual exactly. The judge with eyes severe and beard of formal cut will evaluate your essay. If you waste the time of the court, a fine may be levied, capons or chickens, or in academic terms, if you provide the judge expert testimony and a well-written paper, he will judge you more favorably. Indeed, as you become an expert in the subject you research, you may find yourself sharing your knowledge as a friend of the court.